Hi, everyone. Bertold Gambrell here. The following is a conversation I had with my good friend and fellow indie author, Mark Paxson. Mark is the author of many books, including One Night in Bridgeport, Shady Acres and Other Stories, Marfa Lights and Other Stories, the long short story Deviation, and The Irreparable Past, as well as a number of other works in progress and other works that we discuss in the course of the conversation. As well as discussing Mark's thoughts on the indie book market and indie publishing generally. It was a really great conversation. I thank Mark tremendously for agreeing to have it with me, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I do. So without further ado, here's our discussion. So how did you get writing? What inspired you to do it?
I think to the extent there was an inspiration. I've always been a reader. I've been a reader since the day that I could pick up a book and read it. My family is like that. That's what we've always done, is read. And then when I was in my 20s, my dad wrote and published a number of books on writing itself. I think 6 or 7 books in total, writing, punctuation, grammar. And then he also, in my 20s, he wrote several novels. He never got any of them published. But whenever he had a final draft, I read his final drafts, and I just thought, that's amazing. And so for probably 20 years, I had this dream of at some point writing a novel. And I, didn't do much with that dream, but every once in a while I would be sitting around or driving or doing something, and I would come up with this great opening line or this opening scene. And I would think, okay, but then what do I do? I have no idea what to do next. And so all of those opening lines and opening scenes would just go away. And then I think it was probably 2003, a friend who I think knew about this bucket list item that I had told me about National Novel Writing Month. And it was right at the end of October that she told me this. And if for people who don't know, that's this thing where in November, people sign up and try to write a 50,000 word novel in 1 month. And so she told me about it, and I went online and learned about it. And when I was driving home that night, I, in my head, did a rough outline of a story that came to me. And it was basically at the time when Kobe Bryant was on trial for sexually assaulting a woman in a Colorado hotel room. And what I came up with was, okay, it's not Kobe Bryant. It's not somebody who can afford $1 million attorneys and the best criminal defense attorneys in the land. It's just someone who is just an average Joe who can't afford all that and has a one-night stand and then is accused of rape afterwards. And that's what started me down this path of writing. It took me a year to write it. It took me another year to rewrite it. And once I had started doing that, then I just, all sorts of ideas about short stories and other novels to write. And I would say for probably the next 10 years, I did a huge amount of writing. The last 5 or 6 years have been a struggle. So that's how I got started.
I see. That's I love the novel One Night in Bridgeport. It's a great novel. It's especially interesting to me is because the protagonist, as you say, he's facing this accusation, which is unfair against him. At the same time, he's not, and I won't say too much for people who may read the book, but it's he's not a terribly likable guy.
Right. Right.
I think that makes it a really interesting. It's a very interesting dynamic as you read that.
It's one of the things that I think is important in what I write is to make. I don't like the idea of the perfect narrator, or the perfect main character or whatever. Everybody has flaws, and I try to do as much as I can to not produce somebody who's perfect.
It's,
So
it's really, it makes for more interesting characters. I have to ask, there's one scene in that book where you describe the snowfall, and how
hmm.
the snow sort of muffles all the sound around it. I love that scene because I love that effect. And so tell a ignorant Ohioan, does it actually snow there that much?
Not in Sacramento where I live, but there's plenty of snow up in the Sierras and north of here, and you know, east of here, and that image came from, you know, growing up in Sacramento. I've never lived in the snow. I visit every once in a while, but I didn't go up to the snow probably from when I was 8 or 9 until my kids were born, and my oldest son was 4. So it was probably almost 30 years between the times that I went to the snow. And we went up to stay at a cabin with some friends. And there was this moment when we were up there and we were outside there. They had this little slope outside their house, their cabin, where the kids could sled down, and it was, you know, a huge amount of fun. My 4-year-old, basically, if he had his way, he would still be up there sledding down that little hill. But there was this moment when we were out there in the afternoon and it started snowing, and I just noticed how quiet everything became. It was just like this this moment of just quiet, peaceful, and beautiful with the snow falling. You know, it wasn't a heavy snowfall. So that image has always stuck with me about what it can feel like when you're outside and it's snowing.
And it's translated perfectly in the book because I know exactly what you mean, and I love that scene for exactly that reason. So you talk about how after Bridgeport, sort of the floodgates opened and you started writing. So I've read uh, Shady Acres and other stories, the Marfa Lights, which I forget which one came first, or
I think I published the Marfa Lights first, but they were both pretty. I basically published the 2 collections of short stories first as experiments to see if I could get the process right, and then I published One Night in Bridgeport some period of time after that.
okay.
So
So I had the order wrong. I didn't. I thought.
yeah,
Okay, got it. Um, I love both collections.
thank you.
They're especially I love in Shady Acres the opening sequence where things are sort of linked together. You know, and I forget, was that part of like was that a challenge you like set for yourself, is how to construct a story like that, or
Shady Acres?
yeah.
No, well, so what happened with that is there's NaNoWriMo in November, and then there's another organization I learned about back then called Story a Day, and what they do is, in the month of May, the objective is to write a short story every day for a month. And so I decided to try to write basically a collection of short stories about the characters, you know, the people who live in a senior citizens, you know, a nursing facility. And I don't know if it was always going to be kind of a linked set of stories or just individual standalone stories. At some point, I wrote a few and decided to connect them in a way to have something, you know, kind of weave through the stories from beginning to end. But that's kind of where that story came from.
Both collections are just, they highlight how versatile you are as a writer, because you've got like what I guess broadly I'd call literary fiction. There's some stuff that's almost like post-apocalyptic, I would say. Some stuff that's science fiction. Some of it's funny. It's really great. I mean, did you set out to like try that, or did you just write whatever comes to mind?
It's I write whatever comes to mind, and I know, you know, there are plenty of, and I want to make sure that this doesn't come across as any kind of criticism of how other writers do things or how they want to do things, but You know, a lot of writers write in a genre and that's all they write. And to me, that would be, for me, that would be very boring. Just to write the same genre, the same type of story over and over again. And so when I write, I come up with an idea and I just start writing it. And if it turns into a science fiction idea or a post-apocalyptic idea or a legal thriller or literary fiction, it is what it is. And that's part of the challenge to me, is writing different types of stories, coming up with different ways to tell stories, like the linked short story concept for Shady Acres versus one story. I mean, that's, you know, that story is probably around 13 or 14,000 words. But it's multiple stories that tell a larger story. I like the challenge of trying to figure out how to do those things. And again, writing different kinds of stories.
It's pretty awesome because, yes, I love reading the collections because you never know what's coming next, which is a cool feeling. It's like a feeling of discovery. You also, I recall once reading on your blog, you talked about writing poetry as like, it was a good Kickstarter, if you will, a good way to like sort of get the creative juices flowing. And I know there's at least one poem in, do I have it right? It's in the Marphalites, and I can't think of the title at the moment. I apologize.
Gosh, I should have my books here. I don't remember which collection it is, but it's the one, it's kind of a post-apocalyptic thing, and it's told in rhyme. Oh, what the heck was the name of that? Actually, I know the story. The title of that poetry story was Untitled.
That's right. That
was the title of it.
So that's why we couldn't think of it then.
Yeah,
that makes me feel better.
That is posting my poetry. I think is one of the most nerve-wracking things that I do on my blog, because I consider myself to be completely incapable when it comes to poetry. But just to expand on that story, the reason why I wrote that is because someone told me about it's basically a children's story that I would say is probably a short novella length told entirely in rhyme. And I think it was called Ziramagosa. I'm going to have to look it up. But it's like, wow, again, coming up with a different way to tell a story. And I there's no way I could carry that for a novel or, long short story length, but I wanted to see if I could come up with a way to tell a story in rhyme. So that's where that story came from.
I'm glad you mentioned long short stories, because you are the person who introduced me to the concept of the long short story, which is like a perfect length. I love it's just, about roughly 16,000 words, I think it is, somewhere in that mark.
One of the things that the internet and ebooks has done is given writers the opportunity to write stories of any length. Which it doesn't have to be 80,000 words. It doesn't have to be 150,000 words. It can be any length.
I read a great blog post, and I'm kicking myself because I never bookmarked it, and now I've never been able to find it. But it was about how, at a certain point, publishers, for largely printing reasons, decided, okay, 80,000 words is going to be what we standardize on. And that just became, novel has to be 80,000 words. And even now, when we're not printing stuff at all necessarily, it's still like this archaic holdover.
Right.
And yeah, I think the internet is great at liberating people from that, because it's, if you're like me and don't, necessarily respond to strict guidelines well.
Right.
So yeah, I love deviation. It's got this, it's the perfect length. It has like this darkly, almost comical, I would say, sense to it. Not that it's a comedy, but
there is something, and that's, one of the things that I like about that story is I very rarely, in fact, I think you and I had an exchange about one of your stories when you asked me to read it before you published it, and you said it was a there was some humor in it. And I said, I'm sorry, but I generally don't see humor in stories when I read. It's just, for whatever reason, I don't see that or get that. But I think there's some humor in deviation. Like you said, comic, some comic relief as it goes through a pretty serious set of events.
Another work of yours, maybe your major, certainly a major work I know you worked on a long time, The Irreparable Past, which, again, first of all, I love it's, I think I mentioned this to you once on Twitter, but ever since reading that, I always look at the word irreparable. It looks wrong to me now.
Good. My work here is done. I don't have to write another word. I will never understand how that word is spelled that way.
But I guess, yeah. So where did the idea for The Irreparable Past come from?
For years, I was a regular daily visitor to a website called Toasted Cheese. And for a long time, they had this Friday feature. They had, they publish a quarterly online literary journal, and they do all sorts of other things. They have, different chat forums and things. And on one of them, every Friday morning, they would post Friday FUM, F-U-M, and I, to this day, don't remember what F-U-M stands for, but it would be a series of questions, things for, people to respond to. And one of them was almost always, 3 things from the week that you enjoyed, or 5 things that you're looking forward to next week, or things like that. And so one of them, one of the other writers who responded to it one week is a guy by the name of Bob, another name that I struggle with. His last name is spelled Zeanah, and he lives in Mobile, Alabama. He has published a couple of cozy mysteries. But at the time, one of the things he responded to, a moment from the week that he enjoyed was sitting on the front porch of his house, looking out over Mobile Bay, watching a great heron feed in the shallows. And just like immediately, that created an image in my head. And I decided I wanted to write a story about an old man essentially living on his own in a setting like that, and how he came to arrive at this place where he was living alone, and he was perfectly happy living alone with his only friend being the heron in the shallows, which in my book turned into an egret.
It's a great image. I mean, I can see, and that does tie in with you described a writer whose name I can no longer remember, sadly, who gave the advice of I think it was borrow people. Basically, if you see someone, see something interesting.
Just yeah. I've been to, I think, 2 writing conferences in my life. One was at the local university very, very early in my efforts at writing, at Sac State. And the lunchtime speaker was Dorothy Allison. And her most famous book is Bastard Out of South Carolina, which was actually made into a TV movie. But she told this story about driving through the South one day, and she had, she was in the middle of writing one of her novels, and she stopped to get gas. And while she was pumping gas, she noticed a local police officer pull up in his car, park along the street near the gas station, get out, open the rear door of his car, and take out a hat box, and then walk into the nearby business. And she said that became a character in the story that she was working on. And what she said was, that's what writers do. We steal people. Whether it's your crazy aunt who lives in Chicago, or a police officer pulling up in the street, doing what she saw that day, or, whatever, walking around, we see people and something happens, and we steal people. for purposes of telling our stories.
So that's the irreparable past, and from that, like that scene,
Yeah.
the whole, which is a great book. I love the prose in that is just beautiful.
So you know, you asked earlier about poetry. One of the things I tried to do with that book is write it more poetically than other efforts. And I actually hold on just a minute. I was going to start each chapter with a poem, and I think I just left in the first poem. Yeah, I left in the first poem because I couldn't come up with a poem for each of the chapters. So I didn't want to have some chapters with a poem and some without. But I found that doing that, though, again, writing a poem does something to your writer brain. Part of it is rhythm and flow. Part of it is realizing how many words aren't actually necessary. But so anyway, that's the other part of the irreparable past related to some of your questions is I tried to do that as quote unquote poetically as possible without caring about rhyme and all that other stuff.
I mean, it absolutely shows. It has just this beautiful, like, voice to it. Like, sometimes I read a book and yeah, the narrator's voice gets sort of stuck in my head for a while, and that absolutely happened with The Irreparable Past. Now, let me ask you about a book of yours that I've never read because I don't think it's on Kindle. Weed Therapy. Am I right?
Yeah, it's published, but then it was unpublished.
Okay.
Because it's a little bit too autobiographical and it caused some problems.
Oh, okay. I won't make you elaborate on anything.
Thank you.
But I mean, I will say, I mean, it makes me sad. Like, it's like a Mark Paxson book. I kind of want to read that, but.
Well, and I, you know, a writer forming opinions about how, you know, where their stories rank in terms of really good is a dangerous thing, but I really, really liked that story. Really liked it. It happens.
Speaking of stories that perhaps, I don't know, could be not for that reason, but for other reasons, I could see being a problem. The Jump. I know that's a work sort of in progress that you have going on. I love the opening of that. I love it so much. It's becoming more relevant, I think, as time has gone on.
It's actually, I think, one of the reasons, besides my general problem with writer's block these days, one of the reasons why I slowed down and kind of stopped on that is for that very reason, because when I started writing it, it was, and let's just name the elephant in the room. It was either right before or right as Donald Trump was throwing his hat in the ring in 2015, and it was absolutely not intended to be any kind of have any relevance to Donald Trump. Just absolutely not. That was not the intent. But as things developed, and it's like, well, okay, so it's something I'm going to go back to at some point. I don't know when, but I really liked the first few chapters that I produced on that, and I hope that at some point I can go back to it and finish it. Speaking of which, do you want to finish it?
That would be a story of yours that I might have a chance at finishing it, and it wouldn't look like just something else had been welded onto this thing.
Yeah, well, I'll write a story that starts in Omaha, Nebraska, and travels around the Midwest, and you'll take it to another planet.
I have a couple more questions about your work if you want to.
Okay, sure.
So you just finished publishing well, I know there's more to come, but The Dime, you've arrived at sort of a breaking point there. And I know that's one you worked on for a long time. It was originally titled Northville Five and Dime.
Yeah. Oh gosh. So that one was a writing prompt from some website or blog, and I don't remember where I got it from. But the prompt was to write a story about a shoplifter who's caught and is offered a deal to get away with it. And the first ideas or whatever that I had all revolved around, okay, have sex with me and you can go away. And okay, but that's so obvious. So I came up with a completely different premise, and it's based in the small town of Northville in upstate New York, at the Five and Dime there, because the prompt and me coming up with that story happened a few months after we had gone on vacation, and among other things had gone to Northville to see an old childhood friend of my wife's. And they have a Northville Five and Dime. They advertise themselves as the oldest continuingly operating Five and Dime in the United States. So that was from a writing prompt. And it was going to be, I mean, the interesting thing is both The Jump and that story. So going back to The Jump, the first chapter, the opening that you talked about, that was it. That was what the story was going to be. And with The Dime, the opening chapter or two, that was it. That was what the story was going to be. But with The Dime, after I wrote the first chapter or two, I think it was the first two chapters, I went to my second writing conference in Mendocino. And in that conference, each morning we had a writing workshop with the same group of 12 people and an author by the name of Peter Orner. And every participant had to submit, 10 or 15 pages of something. And then each morning, 4 people would essentially have their work critiqued by everybody else in the group. And I submitted the first 2 chapters of Northville, or The Dime, for that. And by the time the conference was over, I thought, okay, there's more story here. I want to tell more story. So I wrote the part that is out on Wattpad now. And I thought, okay, that's it. Story's done. And I gave it to my son, who was probably, I don't know, 15 or 16 at the time. And he read it in one night. And then I asked him, so did you read it? Yeah, I read the whole thing. Why don't you sound very happy? Because I hate you. It's not over. It doesn't end. Which he says about virtually everything I've written that he's read. But when he said that, it's like, okay, yeah, there's more story there. So I wrote the second part, just finished it a few weeks ago. I legitimately, if I wanted to, if I could develop an audience for that story, I could see it having many parts for many years. But we'll see what happens.
By the way, what has your experience been of Wattpad?
The only people who voted on it or commented on it are people who know me through social media. There's absolutely no engagement with anybody else. And there were 2, they have these features that, supposedly help you get your story out. One is called Share Your Story, and they have a page for each genre, and you go into the genre that your book is, and you post the blurb about your book and the cover and the link. And then there was another time when someone wrote requesting stories that were young adult stories that, featured certain things, didn't feature other things. And I thought my story fit what he was looking for, so I posted there. And is near, like I said, the only people who commented on it, voted on it, were you, Carrie Rubin and Dale Rogerson, who's a blogger who has been following me for a while. Other than that, virtually no engagement with anybody else.
You mentioned this on Twitter the other day, and I don't know how much detail you want to go into it, but you alluded to a title called Terror in a Small Town.
Yeah.
I have to ask about that.
So this is, I started actually, I believe that was the first novel length story I started writing after I completed the 2 or 3 years of writing and rewriting Bridgeport. And the idea behind it is that 9/11, as bad as it is, as horrible as it was, as deadly as it was, it's not actually terror for most of the country, because it's a big, huge target in New York City, and people in Kansas City or Cleveland or Orange County, California, aren't going to feel that terror. And my idea was, if the terrorists really wanted to bring terror to the United States, they would essentially launch a series of smaller random attacks throughout the country. At a high school basketball game, at a church service, on the roadside as the school bus goes by. I don't remember off the top of my head what some of the others were, but as with most things, I got 30 or 35,000 words into it and then just became overwhelmed with what I was trying to do. And it's been sitting there for a long time. And it's always, again, something that I've wanted to go back to. But a few years ago, with all of the shootings and other things going on, terrorist attacks or attempted terrorist attacks, I decided I wasn't ever going to go back to it. But a few weeks ago, I started thinking about it again, and I thought, you know, if I can figure out the path forward to finishing that, I think it's a good story. I mean, it's going to be a scary story for a lot of people, and it's like I don't want to put out the manual for someone to follow.
Right.
You know what I mean? And so I might finish it and then never do anything with it. But and basically why it's called Terror in a Small Town is because one of the attacks is about 45 minutes east of here is a small town called Ione, and they have a maximum security prison in the outskirts of the town. And the big attack in these series of attacks is that basically a terrorist essentially drives a truck full of ammonia nitrate onto the prison grounds, blows it up, and the resulting security breach in the prison allows hundreds of prisoners, maximum security felons, to escape. And not only that, but one of the terrorists' cohorts, allies, whatever you want to call them, is there with a truck full of weapons for them to all grab as they leave the prison. So that's why it's Terror in a Small Town.
I see.
So that's that story. We'll see what happens. I've finished going through the 35,000 words so far, and there's all sorts of things I need to change, because when I started it was at the tail end of the Bush administration. And one of the things I'm doing in that story, which I've never done before, is I'm telling it in present tense.
Oh.
And so I need to move it forward about 12 or 15 years and update some of the descriptions. Like back then, Osama bin Laden was still alive. Well, he's not alive anymore. So anyway, that's Terror in a Small Town. It may never see the light of day. I don't remember who it was, but there's somebody who decades ago wrote a piece of fiction that essentially became the Bible for right-wing militias. and I wish I could remember what the name of it was. And it's like, I have no idea if the guy who wrote it intended it to be that, but that's what it became. And like I said, I have absolutely no interest in putting something out there that would become the roadmap for some stupid group to follow to say, yeah, that's what we should do.
Yeah, yeah, I can see that you would never, you would not want to be associated with something like that, however unintentionally. So generally, like, what are your thoughts on indie publishing?
As with so many things these days, with the whole advent of the internet and social media and all this other stuff, it's a wonderful, wonderful tool and opportunity, that could be so much better than it is. And my biggest issue, well, first off, writing literary fiction essentially means I'll never be successful as an indie publisher. Kevin and Brandon and I have had some conversations, both in comments online and in emails, that for whatever reason, literary fiction doesn't sell in the indie published world. The things that work there are genres, and I think some very specific genres that I have absolutely no interest in writing in, especially not writing in them exclusively. So there's that. I also am concerned about how much a lot of indie writers don't seem to care about the quality of the product that they put out. And, there's all these stories out there about people who will never read an indie book because they're all crap, which you and I know is not true. We know plenty of authors who, I mean, the thing I like about it is you get stories that the traditional publishers just aren't publishing, and written in a way that the traditional publishers will never touch. I think of Noah Goetz books.
Yeah.
Those are stories are they great literature? No, they're not great literature. Are they Mark Twain? No, they're not Mark Twain, but they're good stories. They're entertaining stories to read, told in a way that, for the most part, traditional publishers aren't going to touch. We wouldn't know how to sell that. Okay. Your stories are like that too. I was thinking about, this conversation, and if we do more of these, which I hope we do, I wanted to talk about, I think in some respects you and I are pretty similar. You're going to think this is weird at first because you tend to write science fiction and interplanetary, whatever, and I tend not to, but you write stories about regular people. You don't write stories about, Kevin Brennan keeps talking about how he's so disgusted at all the naked torsos in the writing Twitter feed. You know what I mean? And how every single one of them has a 12-pack on their stomach, not a 6-pack, but a 12-pack, and all this stuff. And I'm not sure what my point was, but anyway, it's just stories about normal people in circumstances. And when I think about a lot of the traditionally published stuff that I read, and even in literary fiction, and like I said, the character is perfect. No character is perfect. No, so I think it's a, like I said, it's a very it's a wonderful opportunity for people to publish. I just wish the people who are doing it would take it more seriously, and do everything they can to produce a good product that the indie publishing community can be proud of. And I'll just finish this with one other bit. When I first started this, I followed a lot of indie writers on WordPress and read a lot of their books. And there were two writers in particular that I will never forget, who I both reached out to and said, good story, like it, but you got a hell of a lot of typos. I will proofread your stories for free before you publish them in the future? And both of them said no. And they still put stuff out there with all sorts of typos. And I just, that drives me crazy. Have some pride.
I don't get that, because I mean, you reached out the same way to me, and I mean, I was gobsmacked that you would be so kind as to offer your time to do that. I can't tell you how much I appreciate that. So the idea that someone turn that down, I don't get it.
Well, one of them claimed that he already had an editor, to which I wanted to say, well, she's not very good, and I know who it was at that time. I don't know if she still does editing for him, but it's like, okay, well, good luck then. And then the other one was he's just a curmudgeon, and he basically, I think it's he cares about the story. He doesn't care about the details. You know what I mean? His stories are so good, you shouldn't pay attention to the typos.
Well, see, that, I mean, I get that. Like, editing is miserable work. I hate editing stuff. Because, so yeah, but again, it's like, if somebody's offering, I'll do that for you. It's like, great, have at it. I don't want to edit anything.
Yeah. And I know that no matter how many times I read something before I publish it, and everything I've published, I've had, 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 people read it before I publish it. There are always going to be typos.
There are always.
And but every time I've published something, when I hear about them, I go into the manuscript to fix them and reload it, because I don't want something out there with typos in it.
Yeah.
So, but I just wish there was some way for people like you and me and Kevin and the others that we know of to find an audience that's more than our friends, our family, to the extent they're even willing to buy our books. I don't know. Maybe that's a question for you. Do you find very much support for your writing from, not close friends and family, but a broader circle of acquaintances?
Short answer would be no.
Yeah.
Even among those who are readers, there are a few who do that now, and I can't, most of them, even those who are readers, are not necessarily readers of the sort of thing I write. So I can't begrudge them that too much. But at the same time, it is interesting. Like, I think this is actually a broader issue I've been thinking about a lot, is that I think people in general just aren't reading as much anymore because there's just too many other things.
Yeah, if someone isn't a reader, I'm not going to hold it against them. But the thing that bothers me is the people I know who read. And, it's like, so wait, you read, I know you read, and you can't spend $2.99 on an ebook that a friend of yours wrote? What? So anyway, but no, like I said, that's the thing is, I don't know if you know this, but I think I'm going to try to go the traditional route with the dime now, just to see. But I'll tell you, I read something somewhere a week or two ago by someone who shared her publishing experience, and it's the horror of just, you lose complete control. You lose complete control, and if they want you to make changes and you don't make them, you may not have a book anymore. And I don't know what's better: get a publisher and sell a few thousand copies of a book, or do it yourself and have control and be proud of what you did and know it's what you wanted to do and sell a few hundred copies. I don't know.
Building an audience, it's quite a challenge.
Yeah. One of the things for me was, I think Bridgeport potentially spoiled me, because that's a genre that works in the self-published world. And I actually made a couple $1,000s off of that. And then I turned around and published Weed Therapy, and before things happened and I unpublished it, I couldn't find people to buy it. And it's the same thing with the Irreparable Past. Basically, in since November, I probably, I don't know, somewhere around 100 downloads and paperbacks of it. And the vast majority of those are my social media friends and real life friends. Very, very, very few people who don't know me in some capacity. And I don't know how to, I mean, this is the conversation we need to have with a larger group of us is, okay, how do you crack that?
Yeah. I was going to say, to go back to that, what do you think the reason is that literary fiction doesn't get that same kind of audience? Because correct me if I'm wrong, it does when published traditionally, right, by like a big company.
Well, I mean, I think it struggles there too, to be honest. There's a Facebook group, Literary Fiction Writers, that I'm a member of, and there's some conversations there about agents and publishing and things like that. And I think there's a concern in general because most people, for whatever reason, when they buy a book, they want to know what it's going to be. You know what I mean? Literary fiction is this broad category that doesn't necessarily fit a formula. And so it's harder to sell a literary book to someone who's used to reading Stephen King or Danielle Steele or, John Grisham, whoever, when you buy a John Grisham book, you generally know what you're going to get. When you buy a Stephen King book, you generally know what you're going to get. When you buy a literary fiction book from someone you've never read before, do I want to spend 10 or 12 bucks on an ebook from an author I've never heard of, or do I want to spend it on an author that I've read and enjoyed in the past?
I'll tend to take the other route just to be contrarian, but I see what you mean in terms of attracting an audience. Yeah, it's right. It's a difficult proposition.
And I know, I mean, Kevin Brennan, his first novel was published through a traditional publisher. And I think he has some unfortunate experiences from that. And after that happened, he has gone the indie route. And how many, maybe five novels, 4 or 5 novels that he's published on his own now. And he can't give them away.
You're right. I don't, because he writes like I love fascination. That's great, and I don't, and I picked that one. Well, one, I like that book a lot, but 2, I pick it because it's one that, while it is literary, I think you could sort of couch it as like a mystery or a road trip. It's sort of
a road trip,
genre things. And I would think you could sell that, but.
And he's tried to get agents with some of these books as well, and he can't get an agent to.
I mean, I will say, like, for me, it's sort of exciting reading indie books because I feel like I'm discovering these gems that nobody else knows about. Like,
well, it's one of the thing that I said about, would you rather spend 10 or 12 bucks on an author that and you enjoy, or 10 or 12 bucks on an author you've never read before? And to me, part of the joy of reading is discovering something new. I'm sorry, and plus, I hope I never read another Stephen King book again. And I was all into Stephen King back in my teenage years and in my 20s, and I had my Dean Koontz phase, and I had my John Grisham phase, and all. But I don't want to read any of their books anymore. I want new authors, new new stories, new visions, whatever. Just reading Stephen King over and over again. No, I just, please no.
If you'd like to find out more about Mark, his blog is linked below. And of course, you can also check out his books on Amazon. Really great discussion. Again, I thank Mark so much for agreeing to it and all the insightful points and great observations he made about writing and the indie book market. It was a great discussion, and I hope to be able to have more of these in the future. I really do. I hope you all enjoyed it. Let me know what you think. Thanks, everyone. Take care.